Over the next few lessons, we're going to be studying the Holderness coast, Europe's fastest eroding coastline. Holderness is in East Yorkshire and extends from Flamborough Head in the north to Spurn Head in the south, a distance of approximately 61 kilometres. It includes towns you might have heard of like Bridlington, Hornsea and perhaps Withensea. Maybe you've even been there on holiday. The reason that Holderness erodes so quickly is its geology, and there are three main types along this coastline. The first one I want you to look at is chalk. The chalk extends to the north of the Holderness coast, creating a headland at Flamborough Head. That's because the rock here is more resistant. Most of the coastline is made up of boulder clay, which isn't really a rock at all. It's what we call unconsolidated rock. Boulder clay was formed at the end of the Ice Age when the ice sheets melted and dropped a jumble of material that it was carrying. The clay is the fine ground up particles that was ground up by the glaciers as they moved, and the boulders are, well, boulders, larger rocks and pebbles that are inside this clay structure. Because this is unconsolidated, it behaves very differently to the chalk. When it gets wet, it loses its structure and can slump. The third type of geology on this coastline is alluvium. Similar to the boulder clay, it's a soft sediment, it's unconsolidated, been laid down by rivers. It's not really important for our study of this area though. So we have 5 key locations that we're going to look at along this coastline. Our first one is Flamborough Head to the north. That's the headland that we talked about. Next we're going to look at the little village of Barmston, or more importantly the coastline near to Barmston, which is an area that hasn't been protected from the sea. We're going to look at the coastal town of Hornsea, somewhere you may even have visited, an area that is protected. Then we're going to look at Easington towards the south. Easington has got a gas terminal, which means that we've treated it very differently to large areas of this coastline. And finally, we're going to look at Spurn Head. So, first of all, Flamborough. Flamborough is our headland, as you can see in the satellite image to the left of this slide. It sticks out quite a distance into the North Sea, and that's because the rock, the chalk, is more resistant than the rocks in the other parts of this coastline. So when the softer unconsolidated boulder clays have been eroded backwards, the chalk has ended up standing out to sea as a headland. And in the photos you can see some of the features that have been carved into this by the action of the sea. The power of the waves, hydraulic action, has been eroding this coastline for thousands of years now, and you can see caves, arches, and in other parts of this area you can see stacks as well. The students in the top photo are walking along a wave-cut platform next to the wave-cut notch at the base of the cliff, and these cliffs are eroding backwards, just much more slowly than the rocks around them. As those waves strike the weaknesses in the cliff, they carve them out to form the caves, and you can see many of the weaknesses in the top photo. You can possibly see horizontal lines across the cliff, and these are called bedding planes, and then you may be able to see vertical or diagonal lines cutting down through the cliff, and these are called joints. And where many of these meet, you get a weakness, and that's the area where the caves are created. And some of these caves eventually carve all the way through. As the waves swirl around in the caves, hydraulic action and abrasion drill through the coastline until they come out the other side to create an arch. Where those arches collapse, you get a stack, a pillar of rock out at sea that's not attached to the mainland. And where they collapse, you get stumps. Our next site is Barmston, and it's very, very different. Have a look at the geology, or the rocks in the cliff. It's just mud. It's been dried out over many, many centuries, and so when it's dry it does have a structure and it stands up, and you can see the caravans that have been built on the top of that. They've been sited there because of the great sea views. However, this, as you can see from the bottom photo, is a very dangerous coastline because it erodes incredibly quickly. As the waves strike the base of these cliffs, they get wet and they quickly erode away, leaving a wave-cut notch. But also, as rain falls down into the cliff, something we call a subaerial process, then that weakens the cliff as well. It soaks into those rocks, meaning that they lose their structure and therefore they can collapse quite easily. The extra weight that the rain creates within the rock is enough to tear away some of the boulder clay and it falls off, or it can turn it into what is essentially mud and it runs onto the beach. And these are the areas that have been eroding so quickly. You can see in the top photo there's been some attempt to protect the caravan park with some rocks that have been placed out to sea. However, this has largely been unsuccessful. In fact, if you were to visit now, the caravans that are closest to the coast have had to be moved completely because that area of land has gone. And you can also see that the road has fallen off the end of the cliff and onto the beach. The actual village of Barmston is a little further inland, but on the coastline we have farmland and caravan sites, and that's why this area hasn't been protected. It's not very valuable land. Further south we have the tourist town of Hornsea, one of several tourist towns along this coastline. Hornsea is a small town, but it makes quite a lot of money from tourists. You can see in the bottom photograph a caravan park. There's lots of caravan parks near Hornsea. There are golf clubs, there are arcades and fish and chip shops, a promenade to walk along, and quite a nice beach. So Hornsea is dependent on the tourism and the money that comes from it, and because of that tourism there are quite a few jobs there. Hornsea has been protected, and you can probably see three types of protection in the top photograph. You can see a sea wall, which protects the town by holding the line. Hold the line means that we don't allow the coastline to move backwards at all. We've drawn a line in the sand, as it were, and said to the sea, you can't take any more land here. In front of that sea wall, in many places, you have rock armour or riprap. That's to protect the sea wall and break up the wave energy before it strikes the sea wall, and also to protect the beach from scouring away by the waves. And then you can also see groins to reduce the action of longshore drift. The beach is important here. If the beach was moved away, then Hornsea would lose its tourists. So protecting that beach with these groins is vital. However, you can see in the bottom photograph and the arrow pointing to the satellite image that there is a problem. Beyond the last groin, we have what's called the terminal groin effect, where erosion is actually speeded up. This occurs because the groins trap the sediment and stop it moving further down the coastline, which means that the beaches further down the coastline are lower. Waves can hit the cliff much more easily and with much more force. They do so more frequently, and that speeds up erosion in these areas. And so if you were the caravan site owner here, you might be grateful that some of your caravan park was protected by the groins, but you would probably be furious that another part of it was eroding away several times faster than it should be. Our next site is Easington and the Easington gas terminal. Easington is a tiny village that wouldn't be protected normally. It's a bit like Barmston really, with caravan parks and a few historical buildings, but probably not significant enough to be protected. However, it has one big advantage: the Easington gas terminal. The Easington gas terminal brings much of our gas from the North Sea, and therefore it's a really important part of our infrastructure. It's therefore worth protecting. So this area has been protected. However, moving into the future, it's likely that the protection in this area will be abandoned and the coast will no longer be defended. The decision not to improve and repair the defences in this area will be taken because the gas in the North Sea will run out, and so the Easington gas terminal will no longer be useful to us, and quite possibly we'll have moved away from using gas to power our homes anyway. And our final site is Spurn Head, which is a spit. And you can see the thin strip of land in the satellite image with those shallow waters next to it. The salt marsh to the west of the spit is a vital habitat for birds, and it may not look particularly appealing to us, but to wading birds it's fantastic. This is a very fragile part of the coastline, easily ripped apart by storms. In fact, there is a road that runs all the way down the spit that's had to be moved several times. Each time a storm breaks it, part of the road is moved, and so it's quite a challenging drive down the bottom there. This area was protected. There was a lifeboat station, and as you can see, there was a lighthouse as well, and a small settlement at the end. However, the protection of this has been up for debate for a long time, and now the defences have been abandoned, as you can see in the bottom of the bottom photograph there. The revetment that used to be protecting this coastline has rotted away. So this is the Holderness coast. As I said, the fastest eroding coastline in Europe. It's where we would have been taking you for fieldwork to study the different landscapes and the different processes that were taking place there. However, it's unlikely that that's going to happen this year. You still need to know this place as an example of the processes that happen along a coastline and the defences that we might use, and also the positive and negative impacts of those defences on the communities along the coastline. So I've created a booklet for you to work through to help with your studies of the Holderness coast. All the maps and pictures are in there, so that should mean that it's a little bit quicker than it would have been otherwise. You need to use the information from the videos you watched in a previous lesson and what I've said in this presentation to support your answers. You probably also need to do a little bit of research at times as well. The lessons over the next few weeks are going to be taken up with this booklet. It's far too much for one lesson. It should take you pretty much till the end of term.